In our next session, Malia Lazu will talk about why DEI efforts often fail to live up to their promise and how to move from good intentions to real impact in the face of pushback and resistance. Malia is a lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management and author of the recently published book, From Intention to Impact, A Practical Guide to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. As a fellow at MIT's Community Innovators Lab, she launched the Urban Labs to help brands reap returns on diversity. She's the founder and CEO of the Lazu Group. Welcome, Malia.
Thank you so much, Abby, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's been great to see Melissa's conversation. I think we're going to slide right in talking about DEI leadership and how do we actually get there? What does it take to get real change? So I look forward to the conversation. My name's Malia Lazu, as you heard, and I am a lecturer at Sloan and have just written a book about how we actually move from DEI intention to impact. And I'm going to talk about why this is important, us understanding the history of what we're going up against, and then finally how we actually move from intention to impact. So the first thing that I think is important for everyone to remember is that America is not in the process of changing. America has changed. When we look at the U.S. population, we can see demographically America has changed, but we can also see that we're in the middle of a intergenerational conversation. I think often of Archie Bunker, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, wait, is our generation the Archie Bunker? What's happening here? We used to be the meatheads. But what we see is that millennials and younger feel differently about inclusion. They feel differently about how people should be included not only in the workplace, but in society. And this matters because, as Melissa said, the millennials are the largest generation since the boomers, and they are going to continue to make their mark in the same way that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did. So how are we talking about DEI right now? Well, we know we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. There's a lot of politics around that. What we're seeing from the business side is a term called ESG. I'm sure many folks are familiar with ESG. It's a growing industry, as you can see here. And the opportunity here, ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. And I like to say that the S is still really mushy. How we define social is still really up for grabs. And I think an opportunity for a lot of us to define what we mean by social and how we support society and social movements. So, I like to say I come out of organizing. Actually, I worked for Harry Belafonte for several years, and to find myself a bank president and now a business consultant and a lecturer at Sloan has been a really interesting journey. And as I talk about DEI, what I often hear is that it's the right thing to do. And I think that is, right? I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is the right thing to do. A lot of people go to work, though, for money. And what we've been hearing for years and years is that business is about profitability. And I think what we found over the last 10 years is that DEI is actually profitable, right? And, there's a bunch of different stats that you can look at. Some are here. McKinsey Diversity Matters is where a lot of these stats come from. The $16 trillion stat is a Citibank stat. So these aren't stats produced by the NAACP or by the National League of Women, right? These are business consultants seeing that diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually beneficial, not only internally, but externally as well. So what is the history? Now, this is just one timeline, the timeline of slavery. If I had more time, I would, go through others. But when we look at the history of the U.S. and the United States, what we see is that it's been a history of fighting for inclusion. And our actual inclusion has really just started in the 60s, right? And for women, if this was a chart for women, you could even start creating a new pie, right? Of this new era of women having less rights than they did after Roe. So what we're going up against is really American culture, right? And we know who's included by looking at our founding documents, right? Enslaved people were 3/5 of a person. Um, we have, Indians being called savages, and women aren't even mentioned, right? So that's the house. And when I think about our culture, I think about a wonderful West African tale of the elephant and the giraffe. And they were friends. They would hang out in the watering hole. They would talk about the cricket. And one day the giraffe is like, "Elephant, come into my house. Come and hang out with me. We'll watch the cricket together." And the elephant's like, "I'd love to visit." So the giraffe runs home and goes and cleans his house, makes sure that there's no mice, brings in extra peanuts. He wants his elephant friend to feel welcome. And the elephant is walking to his house, excited to go in. He reaches up his trunk and he grabs grasses from the highest of trees, the way the giraffe likes. And he goes to the house and the giraffe welcomes him in. And what happens? Boom. The elephant can't fit, right? And the giraffe says, "No, come into my house, push, push." And he starts breaking the house, the elephant. And the giraffe says, Stop, you're breaking my house. I need you to lose weight in order to come into my house." And the elephant says, "But I'm an elephant. I can't possibly lose enough weight to fit in a house that's built for a giraffe." And this story about the elephant and the giraffe really sums up what we're trying to do when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about inviting someone in. It's about understanding what has been established and how you feel about what has been established, right? This story right here, how you understand this timeline, affects how welcoming your house is to different people. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we're actually talking about is how do we build a house that everyone feels welcome, that everyone sees something familiar, that everyone knows that in a certain way they're a part of this group. So, what is equity, right? We talk so much about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity gets thrown in there in a way that I think has us lose its true meaning, right? Because diversity is a thing, right? You can't do anything about diversity. Mother Nature did something about diversity, right? Inclusion is what you decide to do. Do you include or do you not? But as, as the recent spate of, 911 calls on Black students in Ivy League universities, you can be included, but still not belong, right? And belonging is what you actually need to get equity. Equity is the how. Equity allows people to bring themselves to work. And that's really the magic. If you know you can thrive somewhere, you will bring your whole self to work and you will help your company, get to these goals get to these metrics that we see, right? That McKinsey and others put out. So what actually happens, right? Everyone, I work with a lot of different companies and, no one has ever said like, we don't want women, right? We don't want people with different lived experiences. However, actually moving the needle, right? To move from the intention of wanting to see these numbers or wanting to enter new markets, right? To actually getting there there's these stages that companies go through, and a majority of companies um, stay between stages 1 and 4. And what you see, I like to call 1 through 3 the honeymoon period, right? What you see is the first stage, you decide you can do something. So maybe you sign a pledge, right? And you're excited. So you start to learn about it, right? You start to maybe do a training. And then you realize that you can take action on low hanging fruit. Maybe you're doing a hire and you want to think about, can that be a person who brings in a different lived experience, right? And so you start to take action on low hanging fruit, right? And what happens is that your culture starts pushing back, right? A culture, as Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and your best diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy will get eaten for breakfast by your culture. So, the first step of pushback, and there's 3 steps here about pushback. But the first stage is that it feels like legitimate pushback, right? Oh, well, we just need to run this through compliance. We just need to make sure that we can do this. And you start answering the pushback. And then more pushback comes. And it's in this stage that you start to want to question, what is this pushback? Right? What is this pushback legitimate? Or is this the culture actually trying to reset itself? Right? And so once you realize that this is the culture resetting itself, right? And you understand that what's happening is it's not a legitimate question to ask if you're going to hire less qualified people because you want to have a diverse slate, right? Like that's actually a privileged question, right? You start realizing that these questions are sitting in the concern of the majority. And then you have to make a decision, right? You have to then make a decision if you're going to push through that or if you're going to let the pushback win. And there's a great quote that whenever I think about moving through pushback by Barbara Clark, who is a very, very strong female entrepreneur, supporter, investor. And she says she, sits with men all the time. And it says, are you going to finally write the damn check? Like you've asked these women questions that you haven't asked the men. Are you finally going to write the check? And pushing through that is really, really important. So what can you do? And how can you actually think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your own mind and in your own self? And this is a process that we created right after George Floyd. And part of what we were wanting to do was to create something that people could just take. At the time, if you remember, folks were trying to figure out what they could do, right? They were trying to figure out how they could support a community feeling terrorized. A lot of companies were making pledges, right? If you remember, Jamie Dimon took a knee. There was many examples of wanting to support a community that had just been terrorized. But the first reaction was to ask the community what they needed, right? And again, burdening the community with their own inclusion is something that's not equitable, right? So at the end of the day, we created this in a way to think about how to get into right relationships with communities that you may not have, relationships with. And the first is to listen. You want to seek out communities. You want to seek out conversations that are happening with new communities for you, right? Because these communities might be new to you and what they've been asking for, their agenda might be new to you, but it's not new to them, right? If we think about the conversation that Black people have been having about police, it's centuries old, right? So this idea of not knowing what to do really means that you haven't been listening to what the community is saying. So what's great now is that there's a lot of podcasts, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can hear the community's voice. Um, there's actually a great, I don't want to say resurgence because I don't know if it was ever there, but culturally, with us learning about the disability community, Crip Camp is an amazing movie that was done from the voices of people with disabilities, and it can help you understand their struggle. For a time where we were saying we couldn't afford to put up ramps because it would have, it would be way too costly, if you can imagine, right? That the ADA would have pushback. Listening helps you understand. And then once you listen, you can come into the community and listen to the solutions that they already have. So often people think that they already know the answers. They think that, well, you know what you need to do. You know what we're going to do to help this community. You know what we're going to do to make sure that Black women feel welcome in our company. These types of postures do not build belonging, right? Because I guarantee you that people have gone home and said, you know what they need to do, right? People already have an idea of how they would like to be included and how they would like to see others act towards them. So learning that, listening to be changed, right? Like understanding that there's something here for you to learn and be a part of the solution that they're leading is really important to stay in right relationship. And then lastly, love, right? And, so often once you listen and learn, you have to take action. What else can you do? But it's important to remember that not all action is relevant, helpful, or good for the community that you're taking action on. And so making sure that the action that you're taking is loving, making sure that you are using at the end of the day, that you are using and taking loving action, you are using solutions that communities want you to use is really critical. And an example here of us not getting the 3 L's right as a country is actually the George Floyd conversation. And when we acted, we made Juneteenth a federal holiday, which is not what the Black community was asking for. They were asking for a police reform bill, right? So the idea of a Juneteenth holiday is a response to the killing of George Floyd, might seem like action, but it's really irrelevant action to a community that had a police reform bill and that continues to ask for police reform. So that's just one example of how you can think you're taking action, and really what you're doing is reinforcing your own power and your own privilege. So I am very much looking forward to the conversation and questions that you might have. I want to end with a thank you and reminding all of us that there's a lot of pushback on DEI right now, but it's really, really important for us to remember to remain competitive in a global economy. We have the biggest strength here is our diversity.
Malia, thank you so much. And is that QR code a link to your book or?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. Which the book, by the way, was published in collaboration with MIT SMR. So I'm really happy to be part of that. Questions have come up that really get to different parts of your talk. And what I loved about your talk was that you address it from both the organizational perspective, what do organizations need to do, but then what can we as individuals do? So the first question is, this macro context tells us that the real challenge is to dismantle a deeply entrenched culture that does not believe in equity, et cetera. In your opinion, what are the most effective interventions in helping neutralize and dismantle this deeply entrenched culture that enshrines the status quo and intends to prevent progress? I know that's a lot to cover quickly, but there's a lot in there. But if you could just take a crack at that.
Yeah, so the question is, what are some of the best practices in an interpersonal, not necessarily an organizational?
I think this was the organizational, because it was about culture, um, dismantling an entrenched culture that does not believe in equity.
Yes,
Although
yes. Well, right. And, so I first I think it's important to remember that there are places where you can affect change and there are places where you can't, right? And you don't want to put yourself in harm's way. I joke around and say Jesus only had 12 disciples. You don't need everybody. This idea of who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, why you're trying to change your culture is really important to understand because it's not easy, right? It's not easy to do. And then you want to reach out and organize with the people who are already feeling the way you do, right? And like what we know, for everyone who wants to get into the politics of DEI, most companies know that more people buy Starbucks on the first Tuesday of November than vote. And those are the numbers they're looking at, right? They care about employees and consumers. They don't, you know what I mean? That's what they care about. And they've seen, right, what their customers and their employees are asking for. So, whether it's employee resource groups, right? You start working with the pre-existing networks of people who actually want to make change. And then you start just doing it, right? So take the 3 L's, for example. And in this group, do the 3 L's, right? Read a book together, listen to a couple of podcasts together, right? Talk about the history. I don't know if people have seen the recent history of busing that was out on the American Experience, but one of the gentlemen who was protesting the integration of schools became a civil rights activist and was talking in this movie and saying that he didn't understand what the Black community had been asking for, right? He had never heard that. And so listening and learning as a group will help you take actions that will really make a difference. Modeling the behavior, getting curious, building empathy, right? These are all things that we need deeply in our country, and they're ultimately what builds belonging.
this question is, it's an interesting question, and I'm going to rephrase it. So, when you have pushback, and there has been some sort of overall backlash against DEI recently, and so there's this conversation about why are we doing DEI, and there's some faction that is like, okay, well, we need to focus on what are the business outcomes of that versus we're people, and we do this because this is important to us as a team, as a culture. So can you talk a little bit about that, sort of the business impact versus the, this is something we should do?
Yeah, I have a section in my book that asks the question, are we greedy or are we racist, right? Are we greedy or are we sexist? Are we greedy or are we homophobic? And we really are getting to the basic basis of that question, right? And greed for so long was an acceptable posture of business because that's what they did. I'm not saying I agree with it, all right? But that was sort of, oh, well, we got to do this for the shareholders. It's fiduciarily responsible. And we're now getting to the point where people are understanding that their kids are asking them for clean water and clean air, right? Like their kids are asking them for a different world, and they need to be able to get there. But the other thing is that if you do believe in fiduciary responsibility, then this idea that the smartest room is going to be a room full of able-bodied, straight, white men, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, there's no other place in your life where you don't have diversity, right? Your investments are diverse, right? Your revenue streams are diverse. Like diversity, your biology, right? Your biological tree should be diverse. Like we understand the benefits of diversity in so many other ways, but because of our narrative, we get caught up. So, there's a lot of pushback right now because of the organized movement, right? It was decided, just like during Reagan, right? I mean, Reagan released over 200 amicus briefs or something like that, right? Pushing for an end of affirmative action. There's always been this pushback, right? And it's happening again now. I think the difference is that the younger generations are trying to have a different conversation,
Mm.
right? It's really inevitable. And so you can, you can be the old person yelling at clouds, or you can understand that the world is moving forward, understanding itself differently, especially in places that have an interconnectivity.
Mhm. A number of the questions came in around the pushback. And I loved your graphic. And maybe we can just go back to that for a minute because, I think 3 or 4 of the items on your graphic there had to do with pushback, with recognizing it, with addressing it. And could you talk maybe a little bit more about the sort of what's under there? What's the hardest part of that? And what have successful leaders done to take that on?
Yeah, yeah. I was working with a group of CEOs, and they were trying to do some, supportive work of, different leadership, blah, 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 in a diverse way. And so they each were being a mentor for someone else. And what was fascinating was things that they used to be able to get done quickly, right? All of a sudden there would be pushback, right? There would be questions, that there would be conversation. And for them, like, they don't really get pushback, right? And so they were very quickly able to connect the dots of like, okay, this is happening because, right, of the person that I'm trying to push in the room, the person I'm trying to get into the room. So pushback is natural. That happens with this. And I think, when we talk about the stages is because at first the pushback is legitimized.
Mm.
And I think that's the worst thing that you can do, right? Is think like, oh, well, they're just playing devil's advocate. You can't play devil's advocate to someone's humanity, right? It's just a really awkward thing to do. And not allowing for that pushback to go too far. I mean, we actually suggest that people put out a set of FAQs, that lay out, right, that have the McKinsey studies, right, that lay out this information so that people won't have the assumptions that
Mm.
they have about what DEI will do. And so, yeah, I think that the pushback, what we're asking people to do is change their narrative, right? And that is probably one of the hardest things to do, is to change how you understand yourself in this world. And a lot of straight white men say, well, where's the place for me? Where's the place for me? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, but not center it. The West has done enough damage. I think, continuing to center hurt feelings, might not help progress.
Very good point. Um, Following on the pushback conversation, so are there specific well, actually, this question here around sort of language, their language has become, I think Jim Dietert said it at the beginning of the event today, language has become weaponized to some extent. And so as new terms come up, people grab onto them and give them the meaning that they want to give it. So how do you move forward with what you're talking about, with creating this movement, this culture of acceptance and welcoming, um, with addressing the language, with the words people are using?
Um, how do we how do I think about language?
Yeah. So woke, for example, like has become a very negative term in a lot of people's minds when was a very positive, it was a positive thing.
Right, right.
So within an organization, how do you sort of navigate that shift in language? I think you talked a little bit about it just a minute ago in terms of, just being upfront and forward with your intentions.
Right, right. I think so, and I know we're at time, so I'll be quick with this one. I think language and deconstructing the weaponization of language is really, really important because right now, folks are saying, like, oh, we need to cross out the term black, we need to cross out the term woman, we need to cross this out, right? Not understanding the years that it took to actually get that term in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, to be flippant about it, right? To allow words to be appropriated the way they are, I think is something really unfortunate. And whenever you can whenever you can deconstruct that for someone. I also think that depending on where you are, I mean, again, I think if you're in certain echo chambers, you can think that it's a lot worse than it is. I just went around the country and doing this book tour and had wonderful conversations with people who don't like, this woke this conversation and this attack on woke, that actually appreciate what little bit of interconnectedness we've been able to build.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Malia. Really appreciate it. Love your work, and we'll keep that going.
Thank you very much.
Bye.